Maybe why don't I start introducing you first, and then we can get started. So hello everyone. Welcome to LauraSmith, who is co-director of the Institute for Digital Security and Behaviour and a professor of psychology at the University of Bath. She got her PhD from Exeter in 2008 and has been at Queensland in Australia before joining the Department of Psychology in Bath. She was chief editor of the British Journal of Social Psychology from 2020 to 2022. And she works on the psychology of polarization, radicalization, mobilization, and with a huge current emphasis on the threats and risks of digital technologies. She's been funded by multiple councils, EPSRC, ESRC, AHRC, as well as the UK government. And she was previously a fellow of the British Academy, had a fellowship of the British Academy, a mid-career fellowship. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, Nishant. And it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'll hopefully entertain you with some studies that I've conducted over the past few years. So I'm a social psychologist. I imagine there's a few disciplines represented in this digital room here. But for those of you not familiar, I study group processes and always have. So I look at how social interaction affects our social behaviour broadly. And when I was doing my PhD back in the early to mid 2000s, I came across Facebook, or the Facebook as it was then known. And since then, I've been looking at how social media technologies have and interacting through social media technologies has impacted on our social behavior. So my focus has, in more modern times, moved over to digital technologies, particularly digital communication technologies, and how they influence group-based behaviors. And in particular, I am a collective action scholar, and I'll define that for you in a moment, but broadly means action that people take on behalf of their groups. Now, I'm sure many of you have watched this TV show, Adolescence, that depicts a teenage boy who engages in some interactions online with extreme groups and then perpetrates an act of gender-based violence offline. Now, this is kind of one example of the way in which digital technologies have been implicated in offline violence. And you only have to Google it to find so many different news reports about how people are drawn into extremist groups online, and then they develop motivation for violence and then commit acts of terror offline. There are the school shootings in the US. There are kind of spaces associated with incels, as well as far-right groups and jihadist groups. So there are lots of news stories implicating digital technologies, but actually the science underlying why these communication technologies relate to the mobilization of violence is actually it's quite problematic in lots of ways. So my research over the last few years has been to try and ascertain the evidence for the mechanisms that mean that interacting on social media platforms can mobilize people to violence. So defining collective actions. So this is a social psychological perspective on collective actions. They're actions that people take on behalf of a group that they identify with. So that means that somebody's internalized that the group is part of who they are, part of their own identity, and therefore their actions as a group member represents the interests of that group. And this could be an action that an individual takes alone, as long as they're motivated by group affiliations, that is a collective action. It can also be traditional kind of crowd protests that we might think of when we think of collective action or crowd behavior. But it can equally mean violent extremist actions such as terror offences, misogynistic actions, violence against women and girls, if it's motivated by that kind of internalization of a group as part of somebody's identity. So digital technology is often implicated in this process of mobilization, sometimes because the action itself is facilitated by the technology. So a DDoS attack, for example, perpetrated by a group might be a form of collective action, or it might be that the process of communicating online has led to the motivational capability to engage in collective action online or offline. So I'm interested in the implication of digital technology here. So how can social data science help us to understand what's going on when people use digital technologies in acting and motivating them to take part in collective action? Well, first we have theories based on our understanding of the social psychology of collective action, and we can use those theories to identify forms of data that might help us to study these processes. So we could do theory-driven work using data science techniques to investigate theoretical propositions, or we can use data-driven approaches where we're using data science like machine learning to identify patterns within data sets, and then we can use those patterns to generate testable theoretical propositions. So social data science has been an approach that I've used over the last 5 years or so to try and generate theory, but also test theories of collective action and to learn more about how digital technologies play a role in the psychological processes. And in the work I've been doing lately, I've been using these insights to help inform policy around online safety and practice, particularly working with people from the security sector. So let's go to the theory then. So what do we know from social psychology about why people mobilize to take collective action, and what have digital communication technologies got to do with this process? Well, back in 2015, I published this paper which tries to explain the role of communication. So what we described here was what happens when an individual recognizes there's something wrong with society, something wrong with the world. They perceive that there's this conflict between what's actually happening, so what we call a descriptive norm, how people are behaving in the world, and what they think people should be doing, so the injunctive norm. And when someone recognizes that something's wrong, there's an injustice being perpetrated, there's some kind of grievance that they have with the social situation, they may just think about it, and in that case, because they don't communicate it to anyone, they'll just engage in perhaps changing their own behavior, or not at all. But it's when they communicate with others about their ideas, they give voice to their ideas about what the world should be like, how people should behave, is that they start to create a new social psychological platform for action. So what happens is that when they talk to other people, perhaps like-minded people who have similar viewpoints, they'll validate each other and they'll reach a consensus that actually, yeah, people shouldn't be doing that. There should be some other state of affairs. And that process of discussing with like-minded others and gaining social validation of views can actually transform people's psychology and provides a solid psychological platform for changes of behavior, for actually taking collective action together. And so I theorize that this was the intersection of people's shared identity, social identity, and a shared norm. So it provides this nexus between identity and norms that is a basis for behavioral change, for enacting collective action. So communication can actually provide this psychological change from being only thinking that your ideas about the world are just personally held views to something that you understand as socially shared, and therefore something that you can enact together, change together. So in this second paper, more recently published in Communication Psychology, we talk about the process of polarization around those kind of real-world grievances as a foundation of collective engagement behaviors. And I really explain this as a change in state, where it's kind of like where water boils and turns into steam. It's actually a completely psychological change in state when we move from being individuals to being part of social groups. And in this figure here, you'll see I've represented people with different opinions by different colours. So in the first box labelled A, you'll see people in red and blue with different opinions. And as they start to talk to each other, they'll start to build network connections. So like-minded people will connect up, build relationships with each other. And over time, they'll start to form groups or subgroups. So you can see a society, perhaps an online society, starting to fragment into two separate groups, completely transforming from a set of individuals who don't know each other to two groups of individuals who share opinions but are different from each other. So that's that process of changing from water to steam, that state transformation that we can see happens through communication. And what I think is really interesting now is because of the kind of algorithms, the recommender systems involved in communicating via digital technologies, this process becomes amplified in that you're recommended people like you who've looked at content that you like, and you recommended content that's similar to the things you've looked at before. And so it's kind of amplifying these processes of clustering. And it really shows that we need to understand the affordances of digital technologies in order to understand how they might change or amplify our existing social psychological tendencies. So when I'm trying to explain the role, the impact of digital technologies on our psychology and behavior, I tend to refer to a concept of affordances. And we talk about it a little bit more in this paper, where I use the kind of Gibsonian or Norman's definition of affordances as action possibilities. So the features of digital communication technologies provide us with possibilities for behavior. And those might be intended by the developers of technologies, or they might be unintended, in that people figure out they can use the technologies for certain things. And it's the affordances that those technologies allow for things like building social connections, for validation, and so on, that might change our psychology and our behavior. And I just wanted to show you a little bit of theoretical kind of change over time here in this figure. So this figure is based on a systematic review that I did a couple of years ago, where we looked at all of the theories of from social psychology that have been used to explain online group-based behavior, because I wanted to see how up to date our theories were in explaining how those affordances of technologies are affecting our psychology and behavior. And what I found was actually the most cited theories tend to be those from social identity traditions. So the social identity theory that was written in the 1970s, and SIDE, the social identity model of de-individuation effects, which was written in the 1990s based on CMC technologies. So those theories that try to explain how we are interacting online and how it impacts on our group-based behavior were written, for example, in the 1970s when the floppy disk was invented, or when people were using Wi-Fi for the first time and Google was being developed. There has been very limited theoretical innovation in social psychology over the last 10, 20 years. But there's been such huge technological change that it might mean that some of those propositions that we're using to try and explain behavior are out of date, and they're not explaining how new technologies are changing and amplifying our psychological processes. So I started doing work on how digital communication technologies are affecting collective action. And this was the first study that I conducted, which was based on the Occupy Wall Street movement, which happened in 2011. And this was the first movement that we really kind of identified had been made possible because of Facebook. Back then, we were able to scrape Facebook data. It's no longer possible, but back in 2011, we could do so. So what we did was take 5,300 posts from a Facebook event page that was used to organize the Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, Occupy Wall Street, the hashtag itself was created by an online journal or blog called Adbusters. And in their blog, they basically called for this Tahrir moment, Tahrir Square, referring to a famous protest, and said that they wanted to protest that most of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of people, and there's 99% of people who are suffering because of that. And they called people to Occupy Wall Street in protest against this wealth held by the 1%. And they posted a link to the Facebook event page on their blog, and we had over 5,000 people who joined this page, and they'd used it to organize themselves to occupy Zuccotti Park in New York. So we analyzed the data using content analysis, and we found that people had developed this kind of shared identity based on their agreement with the action itself. So occupying the park would be useful, efficacious for their cause, and based on the fact that they had one demand that they were asking for, and which was revoke corporate personhood, which is this law that means that sometimes organizations can be treated with the same rights that individuals have. And they had this poll on their Facebook page where people could vote for the #1 demand the movement should make, and the top one was this idea of revoking corporate personhood. And there was a lot of disagreement in the post on this page as to whether occupying Zuccotti Park could actually achieve the revocation of this corporate personhood. So the social identities, the shared social identities that seemed to form were based around consensus on those ideas, whether or not they agreed that the action aligned with what they wanted to demand. But we also found longitudinally that people tended to shift in terms of talking about themselves and their own ideas and using first person pronouns like I and me, to using group pronouns, we and our. They shifted only when they had this agreement and they had their ideas validated over time. So it seemed to be that through interacting on this Facebook page, people were gaining a sense of we-ness through their interactions and through the validation of ideas, and that they were reaching consensus on them. But what I didn't have through this data was actual ground truth on whether those people then attended the Occupy Wall Street protest itself. So what I needed then to identify the kind of signals that people had mobilized offline, I needed ground truth data that people had attended a march, and I had data from their online communications. So we fast forward to this next study, which was conducted in 2018, looking at the People's Vote March, which was, if you remember, the anti-Brexit vote march that happened in London. Estimates of between 300,000 and 600,000 people attended the march through Whitehall. And what we did was, with people's consent, were able to download their Twitter data from up to a year before the march. And we ascertained whether or not they attended the march itself. So we had ground truth data on whether they had turned up and mobilized offline, and we had their Twitter activity. And we were looking for the signal of attendance. So what can we tell from their online behavior that would predict whether or not they turned up actually offline and engaged in collective action? So there are two parts to our analysis. The first was just looking at their online activity on Twitter around the 24 hours around the march. So we had 7,500 tweets by 759 users. And we used the features that you can see on the screen here. So whether or not they posted a photo, whether or not they were on a mobile versus a desktop computer, the volume of tweets they posted in the 24 hours around the march, and the kind of words they used within their tweets. So whether they talked about attendance and travel, so the kind of logistics of getting to the march. And we found that combining those features in a machine learning model, we could predict whether or not they attended on the day with 80% accuracy. And that was using around 10 different machine learning techniques for comparison. So it showed that we could kind of understand what people were doing on the day and the kind of behaviors they engaged in online when they were going to attend a march or when they didn't. But it didn't tell us about the psychological process of developing motivation to attend. So what we needed to do was go further back in time. So we had the longitudinal data for a subset of our users that went back up to a year prior to the date of the march. And we were interested in using that data to look at psychological change that might predict their mobilization. So in this subsample, we had 209 of those 209 users of the from the full sample that I just showed you, and they had posted over 200,000 tweets. And we looked at two time windows from 10 to 12 months prior to the march, and then 0 to 3 months prior, because we wanted to see if their behavior had changed over time from those 2-3 month periods. And we constructed an equation which enabled us to capture whether or not they had polarized around Brexit during that time. So this equation captures the kind of language they use around mobilizing. So things like threat and anger, talk of collective action, which we validated in past research as indicating this kind of process of mobilization. So we captured whether or not that increased over time and whether or not that increased for them relative to the sample. So it contextualized individuals' change in language relative to the rest of this sample. So we could see if people had a high score on polarization, they had polarized more than the average person in this data set. And we used a logistic regression model to see if their polarization over time predicted mobilization. So does just getting really, really het up about Brexit mean they're going to turn up at the People's Vote March? We also had other features in our model, like the number of social connections they had and how many likes they were getting on their posts about Brexit. So in this logistic regression model, we found that there was no relationship between polarization and mobilization. So no matter how much people were polarizing around their grievances around Brexit, it wasn't predicting whether or not they turned up to that march. So that was our first kind of finding. But what did predict whether or not they turned up was how many likes they were getting on their Brexit-related posts. So at time one, so this is 10 to 12 months prior to the march, we captured all of their tweets around Brexit and grievances around Brexit and how many likes they were getting on them. And it was that that predicted whether or not they attended, rather than how much they actually polarized around the issue. Which is interesting because it suggests it's not about individual attitude change, but it's about that process of collectivization of grievances. So if you're getting validated by others, it gives you that indication that there's some kind of consensus on this grievance. And that again gives you this more solid psychological platform for taking action. You're not alone. Other people agree with you, and therefore you mobilize. So I think this is interesting in itself because lots of people polarize online. I'm sure any of you who have experience reading social media can see that there's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of extreme views, and a lot of people like shouting into that ether. They post a lot about how angry they are. So that just means there's almost a saturation online of polarized language. And it means it doesn't provide us with this sufficient signal. It's not kind of granular enough to just determine whether or not somebody's going to ever do something offline. And this case becomes particularly noticeable if we think about violent offline actions. So when we're trying to predict something like attendance at a peaceful protest, non-violent collective action, lots of people engage in those kind of protest actions. So it gives us a sufficient sample for ground truth. But when we try and do the same work looking at predicting violent offline actions like terrorism offences, it's a much, much smaller ground truth sample. And that's one of the big problems with doing research in this space. It's just not enough ground truth data to allow us to investigate these signals of mobilisation to violence. And that means that lots of scholars have then kind of erroneously looked at the process of radicalisation as if that means mobilisation. So people will study the kind of polarization towards endorsing violence, or this radicalization process, instead of studying mobilization to violence itself. And this has been called the specificity problem. Because it's just too difficult to predict mobilization to violence or terrorism, people turn to studying radicalization processes. Just like I showed you with polarization, there's a lot of people who are radicalized. There's a lot of radical talk online, just like there's a lot of polarized rhetoric online. And it doesn't mean just because somebody becomes radicalized that they are going to engage in violent action. So there's a problem here in how are we going to study the action of mobilization to violence without just conflating it with radicalized rhetoric. I've got a figure here where, from a paper that I published a few years ago on radicalization, where I talk more about this group process, just very similar to what I've been talking about so far, about how people recognize that they have grievances and they talk about that with other people. And to the extent that their ideas are validated and they reach consensus, they develop shared identities around the need to do something to change the world. And sometimes that is around violence, that we need to take violent action because of our grievances. But because people develop that kind of endorsement of violence, it doesn't mean they're going to mobilize to violence. So there's this kind of missing link here where we need to look at what moderates that effect, what moderates the relationship between being radicalized and mobilizing to violence. And that's what we tried to do in the next study. So we collected a sample of social media posts from people who posted extreme right-wing beliefs. So all of our users in our sample were validated as believing in extreme right-wing ideologies and posting about it. But we had 26 users within our sample who had been convicted of a violent offline offence that could be considered violent collective action. So there's a variety of offences that they were convicted of just because of the nature of the way in which the kind of prosecution services work. But all of the people within this sample of those who'd been convicted of an offence had basically engaged in the action because of their ideology. So it could be considered a violent collective action. And we were interested in just looking at the difference in online behaviours between those people who went on to mobilise to extremist violence and those who held the same kind of beliefs but didn't go on and do anything violent offline. So it kind of gave us that ground truth sample. We had a three-step analysis strategy for this study. We had, first of all, conducted a qualitative analysis of the content of the post, and we did this on a subsample of posts. So we had 30,000 posts that we hand-coded for this purpose. We then conducted a topic modelling analysis on the whole sample, and we compared the topics that came from our topic modelling analysis with the content that we coded through our content analysis. So we could identify the topics that were valid, interpretable, and the most suitable number of topics. We then used the distribution of topics as features in our machine learning modelling to predict the difference between our two groups, so those who'd been convicted and those who hadn't been convicted of a violent offence. So basically for each post, we had the topic distributions, so we knew how much of that post had been from kind of content from each of our topics. And I'll show you a bit more about the topic in a moment. But through doing this process, we were able to distinguish between the online behaviour of those users who had gone on to mobilise to extremist violence and those who hadn't, with 70% accuracy. So on this next slide, I've obscured it for now, but there is some offensive language, so please do look away if you do not want to see offensive language here. These are some example posts and the way in which we have coded them for content and the topics associated with that content. Okay, so this is an example of our 4-topic model that we found to be most representative, and the overlap between the topics that we found through our NLP analysis and the content analysis that we did by hand. So broadly, people talked about kind of sharing information. So we kind of coded that as just information sharing and group formation behaviours. So they often signposted people in their posts to other content and so on, and link people up. The second topic was around hate speech. There was a lot of hateful content, a lot of offensive language towards people from various groups. There was a lot of content relating to violence and violent action. It might have been talking about weapons, known violent events, rallies, and so on. And we found in our content analysis that a lot of people talked about like security of themselves, how they could get away with doing something, how to engage in violence, how to engage in collective action, weapons that they could use, and they also incited violence. And the 4th topic was around ideology. There was a lot of posts around far-right ideology, extremist ideology, and so on. So there was an overlap between our content analysis of the subsample of 30,000 posts and the topic modelling of all of our posts. And so that validated that the topic modelling captured something meaningful. We then used these topic distributions in a machine learning model. So these are the Shapley values that we extracted from our machine learning model. They're quite tricky to interpret. So broadly, what I just want to say here is that if you look at the red kind of dots that skew to the right, they're associated with positively predicting our class of users who had engaged in an extremist action, who had mobilized to action. So you can see that violent action, so talking about violence itself, weapons, operational security, and so on, was positively related to those users who had been convicted of an offence. We also included things like punctuation in our model because of the evidence that suggests that people kind of leak their intentions through the use of emotive kind of linguistic features like exclamation marks and so on. And we found that punctuation was associated with that kind of convicted class. But actually, the more people wrote, so their just absolute word count was negatively associated with that class. So just to kind of summarize our findings across the different analyses that we conducted, we found that actual ideological talk itself didn't predict engaging in extreme violent action. So because everyone did it, the sample was saturated with hate and ideology. So content related to hate speech ideology didn't then provide a sufficient signal to distinguish between those people who'd mobilized and those who hadn't. But what we found was actually talking about the logistics of action and talking about violent action, weapons, and so on was positively related to that class of people who'd mobilized to violence. So that kind of aligns with the previous work I showed you with non-violent collective action, where it's not kind of that polarization and hate that provides that signal, but it's more the process of how do we engage in this action? Are other people allowing us, kind of building our capability to do so? Are they validating our grievances, or are they providing us with a feeling of efficacy that we can engage in action? Okay, so there's a lot of focus in the terrorism literature in particular on ideology and hate speech and radicalization itself, but perhaps it's not that kind of content that we should be looking at here. If we need to think about the mobilization of violence, perhaps we need to look more for how digital communication technologies are allowing people to develop capability, plan logistics, and so on, to develop efficacy to act. So it was only really those who posted about violent action and the practicalities who had mobilized offline. So this study had focused on individual posts, but we know, and as I've talked about through this presentation, we know that radicalization processes and this collectivization of grievance is driven as a group process, that you need lots of people to talk to you about these issues in order to kind of promote motivation for engaging in action. And we also know that social validation is really important. So we need to move on from studying individual posts to studying groups and how groups are interacting as a whole in the network, in their digital forums. So this next study, I looked at the data from a forum in which an extreme right-wing rally had been planned. So in this forum, there are 35,000 posts, 474 users, and it ended in a violent rally. It spans about 3 months of planning and coordination. And we were interested in just looking at who's influencing who and what are they talking about. So what are the kind of necessary roles of influence within a group that leads to offline violence? So we took another kind of complex and multi-stage analytic strategy for this study. We created a new method of using NLP to do a network analysis, and we did a qualitative analysis of the posts to understand the relationship between people's position within this network and the kind of content that they were posting. So my wonderful data scientist that I collaborate with created a new method of network analysis that doesn't need you to know who's actually explicitly replied to whom within a thread. Now, I used ChatGPT to generate this image, so this is not real posts, this is completely fabricated, but it's just there to give you an idea of the kind of data set we're working with. You can't do a network analysis in the traditional sense unless you have people's tags from one message to another. So if you reply to someone's message, it might have an @ mention where you've mentioned their name and then it's your reply. If you've got those data, you can create a network graph of who has replied to whom and therefore everyone's connections. But most kind of forums don't have that information, and people just type without @ mentioning someone that they're replying to. So you end up with this long kind of disconnected stream of posts where some posts are replying to a few posts above, but others are new topics, and it's a little bit disorganized. And so what we did was create a new method of constructing the network graph that's based on how similar the content of the message is to other messages within a 5-minute window. And we chose 5 minutes because it was about the right amount of time for that forum, for like you could see people replying to other posts within 5 minutes, but after that time, the kind of conversation had moved on. So within 5 minutes, we looked at the content of each post and how much it related to each post above it within that window. And it basically meant that we contextualized everybody's posts within the posts around it and have a way of quantifying how similar it was. So we could see how influential each post had been on the subsequent posts. And it gave us a sense of how much influence that person and their post had had on the next posts. So it gave us a metric of influence just by looking at how similar the language had been and kind of capturing how many people had replied to their post. So we built this network that looked at the connections between users and the strength of those connections based on how much content they'd shared. And we did a qualitative analysis to look at the kinds of roles people were playing within the forum. Now, these are all paraphrased quotes, so again, not real data here, just paraphrased. And what we found was that people talked about the practicalities of the rally, so how they're going to get there, what they should bring, and so on. They talked about kind of just the social side of their group, their ideology. They shared links with each other and content. And they talked a little bit about the kind of ideology, and then they also just did a lot of kind of engaging in hate speech and incitement of hate and violence. So a lot of racism, misogyny, and so on. So those are the kind of roles people were playing, the kinds of things that they were posting. And we had a look at for those people who were kind of central in our network, we had a look at what was their most frequent posting type of behavior, whether it was talking about practicalities, inciting violence, etc. And what we found was that the people who were kind of statistically focal in the network, so if you look at the cloudy image here, the biggest, darkest blobs in our image, they were statistically focal and they were having the most influence and making the most connections in the forum. And they were the ones actually spreading kind of the hateful and inciting content. So they were proliferating those ideas about why they needed to attend this far-right rally, and basically created the motivation for the violence. So they were, you might want to say, radicalizing other people to violence. And then if you look at the tiny dots around the outside, the people who are more statistically peripheral in this network tended to focus on practicalities. So they weren't engaging so much in that kind of inciting violence, motivating people to attend. They were just asking about how they were going to do so. How am I going to get there? Can I share a lift? What do I need to bring with me? What time are we meeting? Those kind of practicalities. So interestingly, just engaging in kind of chat about logistics wasn't influential in this network. This network was talking about why they needed to organise this rally, what the purpose was, and providing the motivation for mobilising. But both roles matter. So you need people to organise, you need people to understand how they're going to attend an offline action. You also need the motivation for doing so. So groups need people who are doing both the organising practicalities role and developing motivation in others. So it gives this kind of interesting group lens on this collective action scenario where you need to look at the whole forum to understand why people turned up at that rally and why it ended in violence. But it also shows the importance of influencers. And it's kind of widening this window to look at move away from just looking at those individuals who turned up and were violent to understanding why they might have done so. And it might, if we don't have ground truth here of who turned up and who was violent, but it might have been those people on the periphery who had been talking about how to attend, who'd been reading all the messages about the necessity for violence. So we need to widen the window and understand that whole group context to understand why people act the way that they do. And it really highlights that difference between developing motivation within a group for violence and developing the capability of people to engage in it themselves. So I spent a lot of time just talking about the kind of behaviours people engage in online when they might be about to go on to engage in peaceful or non-peaceful forms of collective action. But a lot of the content I've shown you is also quite harmful. It kind of inherently contains risk. It might be offensive, it might incite violence, and so on. And there's lots of talk at the moment about how we can mitigate online harms like incitement of violence and hate. And there's multiple ways in which this could be done. So through disruption, so it might be breaking up a network like I just showed you. There's regulation like the Online Safety Act. There's moderation in online forums that's actually being scaled back, rolled back by some companies at the moment. There's detection of harmful content with algorithms. But when you're taking down lots of content, it becomes a whack-a-mole situation where it just keeps popping up elsewhere and it's kind of continual trying to take it down. So how then might we mitigate the harm that could come from risky content? Well, as part of a team at Bath, we've been doing some work on understanding the contextual vulnerability online that can give rise to harm and resilience. And to do this, because we need that ground truth again, we've created a simulated social media platform. I just wanted to briefly show you what it looks like, because not everything can be solved through analysing archival data sets. There's lots of noise and messiness that comes with that kind of work. So we created this social media platform for online experiments where our participants would sign up, read the community rules, create a profile, and then spend 10 minutes just scrolling through the content. And it kind of looks like Facebook, and we have basically populated everything. So it's all completely controlled. And although it looks like there's lots of other people interacting on there, actually it's all pre-planned and created by ourselves. So participants sign up, full consent, and scroll through it. And it's ostensibly a online group for people who care about climate change and want to engage in climate-based collective action. And lots of the posts are people engaging in peaceful collective action, so protests and so on. And our participants can like and dislike and flag content. But embedded within this experiment, we have target posts that depict violent forms of collective action and disruptive, illegal forms of collective action. And what we did across our 3 experimental conditions was vary how much there were likes and dislikes on those posts. So in one condition, we've got perception of high consensus around that kind of violence and disruptive action. So there are lots of likes on those posts, but hardly any dislikes. So it looked like the consensus of the other users on the platform was that violence is a good thing, or disruptive illegal action is a good thing. And in another condition, there's kind of equal-ish numbers of likes and dislikes. So you can't tell actually what the consensus is. And then in our other control conditions, there's only likes, just like you might see on Facebook. So you can't tell what the consensus of this online community is around those kinds of actions. So there are kind of peaceful sit-ins, there are slightly more disruptive forms of action, and then there are more violent actions depicted in as target posts. And some conditions like this one you see here, there's this equal number of likes and dislikes, so the consensus is hard to tell. Okay, so our participants engaged in this, and in the first study, we basically found very little difference across our conditions, and that people were saying that they understood the need for violence. Oh, sorry, I went too far then. They understood the need for violence pretty equally in all conditions, although where there was high consensus on those posts, there was a significant difference between that and the control condition, but no difference from when there's low consensus on those posts. And on things like pro-violence attitudes and intentions to engage in this kind of what we call non-normative action, there was no difference. Okay, so study 1, all we found was this correlation between perceived consensus on the platform and our measures like understanding violence. So what we did, we ran the study again, but this time we've tried to make our manipulation stronger. So we basically had 0 dislikes on those target posts in the high consensus condition. So people could have disliked the posts, but nobody did. So there's absolute consensus that engaging in those kind of violent and disruptive actions was okay. And by doing so, we started to find the patterns we expected. And these are the raw means here. What you can see is that everything's a little bit higher in the control condition, which we weren't expecting. But then when we looked at our distribution of participants, we found that actually there was this failure of randomization where there were more people in the control condition who would engage in violent or disruptive action before the experiment. So we had to control for that. Once we controlled for that, we then found the patterns that we expected, where in the high consensus conditions, people were reporting they understood the need for violence more. They were more likely to say that they would engage in violent and disruptive action in future, that violence was acceptable, and that they had pro-violence attitudes. So simply through seeing that there was more likes on the posts that depicted violence. We also looked at the role of social identification with other users on the platform. So that understanding that they kind of shared an identity with each other. And we found that there was a main effect, so that more people identified with other users on the platform, the more they endorsed or said they were likely to engage in violent and disruptive actions in future. And we also found that interacted with that high consensus versus control condition. So when there was low identification with the other users, people in the high consensus, there was no difference between the high consensus and control condition on action intentions. Same when there was average social identification. But when there was high social identification with platform users and people were in the high consensus condition, they were more likely to say that they were going to engage in disruptive and violent actions. Basically means that people attended to that feedback more if they cared about the other users in that platform. So when they felt that the people on the platform were like them, that they shared something, had something in common, they attuned to the feedback they were getting on those posts. So it just shows one of our psychological vulnerabilities to seeing the kind of violent endorsement of violence online is if we're seeing it from like-minded others, those we identify with, it's more likely to have an impact on us. We also found that the more that people engaged with the platform, so the more likes they were giving on all of the posts, the more they reported identifying with other users. So it was amplifying that effect. So I'm going to wrap up now because I'm aware we're getting short of time. So we'll go back to the big picture. So what I've tried to demonstrate here is that online interactions aren't trivial. And a lot of the talk, especially in social psychological circles, is that online interactions or online action, things like signing petitions and so on, sharing things, hashtagging campaigns, they're trivial, they're low cost, it's easy to do. But actually what our data show is that they can be action in and of themselves, in that people are trying to create the conditions, the group level conditions for action. They're helping to create motivation for action, build networks and build people's capability for engaging in action. So these online interactions are not trivial. But at the same time, we mustn't see polarization and radicalization, that attitude change, as the same as mobilization offline. So there's different processes, different signals perhaps in our data that predict mobilization than that show polarization. And to understand the impact of interacting via digital communication technologies, we needed to account for the nature of the content itself. So whether it's inherently risky, it depicts violence, something harmful, or encourages violence. We need to understand the affordances of a platform for things like consensus feedback, validation, algorithms that recommend content. And we need to understand the fundamental social psychology of the people using the platforms. And this is really important because if new technologies are enabling companies to micro-target content and recommendations to people, and we know that people's psychological profile predisposes them to be susceptible to what they see from certain others, we know there's a heightened level of risk there. So we need to understand the kind of trifecta here of content, affordances, and psychological processes in order to predict the impact these technologies are going to have. On that kind of point about predicting, or at least thinking about how technology might change things, I wanted to point out this commentary I wrote recently that highlights that we can use.
Oh, just play money in my wise mountains if you need it.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
So that may have been a mistake. I muted for a second. Let you finish, and then they can ask questions. Yeah.
We talk about the UKRI framework for responsible research and innovation in this paper, where we talk about how you can actually use this framework to anticipate and think about unintended consequences of the development of technology and how it might impact on psychological processes and ultimately on society. And I'm going to end it there. So I've only left 5 minutes for questions, but I hope that's sufficient. Thank you.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Laura. I'll open the floor for questions. Sandrine.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, really fascinating. And each time I had a question popping up, actually, you ended up answering it afterwards. So actually, my list of questions has shrunk quite considerably. But maybe just one question I had was with respect to this idea that this result that you found that posts that had like users that had likes, the number of likes that they got, this tended to predict their likelihood to mobilize. I was wondering to what extent you were able to perhaps rule out the interpretation that maybe the causation goes in the other direction, in the sense that potentially the people who get the most likes and are shared the most are actually, to start with, the people who are organizing those events. you know, instead of being people who decide to mobilize after receiving those likes. Do you see what I mean?
So your question is whether we can rule out whether it's the fact that they're the organizers, almost like they're the people in the public eye. Is that
Yeah,
what
exactly. They're public figures. They're influential people in that community. They potentially are the ones who already launched, you know, this idea of mobilization.
Yeah. So we don't have data on whether they're organizers or not. So I guess empirically we can't answer that question now. I doubt that they are the organisers in the for that particular march, the People's Vote March. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of attendees, and we sampled a few hundred. So the odds are that they're more likely to be just the everyday person who attended that march. We have actually done it. We have got a paper where we looked at organizer accounts. So that was looking at organizer accounts for the Black Lives Matter protests and counter protests, and we compared. Or we basically looked at the content of those accounts and what they were posting around organizing. We didn't look at likes in that one, but their content was much more about facilitating it, the marches, the protests themselves. Whereas what we looked at here, so the content that they were getting likes on was just grievances. So it was like the anger about Brexit. So it wasn't so much they were getting likes on the organizing posts, it was on the posts about grievance.
Okay, interesting.
So I guess that's as far as we can go empirically there. But I think it's an interesting question because there are differences in roles in these groups, and like showed up with the network study, and some people are organizers, some people are not. I would say in a very large protest like that one, most people will not be the organizers.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess very quickly, if I can just jump on that a little bit. Also, I guess perhaps maybe not as being organizers, but perhaps as being public figures in the first place, meaning that if they do express something that is already a commitment to more than just expressing an opinion, but actually potentially representing a cause.
Yeah, leaders. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's all anonymous, so we don't know if there are like famous public figures in there. Again, I imagine they didn't want to fill out our consent form and questionnaire. But I think leadership in this space is also a very interesting question, and something we're following up at the moment with other more recent events, like the riots in the summer. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you very much.
So Laura, I don't know if you're familiar with Paulo Gerardo's work, who he wrote a book about some of the same protests that you've been looking at, like Tahrir Square and Occupy and so forth. And he claims that many of these are leaderless revolutions, and he comes at it more from a sociological standpoint. I don't know if you've read that, and if you have any opinions about leaderlessness or leaderfulness of these kind of revolutions.
Oh, it's interesting because Occupy was very much, well, they almost promoted themselves as leaderless. Like they had this
Yeah.
process. They didn't want leaders, but the social psychology of leadership sees it as a process of influence rather than people in a position where they're organizing or bringing people together. So the process of influence tends to happen in any group where people stand out as having more of an impact on the way that the group forms or behaves. So I would tend to look at it as who is influential in terms of the social influence they have on the group and its norms. And it's very hard to have a group that doesn't have people who are more influential than others, even if they're not like the stand, there's like 3 people who lead out of 100. It might be that 20% of people are more influential, but that is still leadership in itself.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think there's a difference between that kind of structural leadership and people in roles that are formalized and the process of influence, which is how social psychologists would see leadership.
Ari, sorry, I had to cut you off earlier.
That's all right. Here we are. Laura, thank you so much for this. This was fascinating. I'm a sociologist up in Edinburgh, and I study kind of the pretext of horizontalism in these kind of leaderless movements, but also kind of individual takes on collective action that are not oriented towards acting on behalf of the collective, but individually. And as a social psychologist, I'm curious, have you seen any kind of, we'll say, frustration with lack of opportunities for collective action, and therefore not so much rogue individual actions on behalf of a group, but kind of internalizing some of those discourses and thoughts and feelings, and then acting in terms of what people think is right, but not kind of as stewards or kind of representatives.
Yeah, so that's really interesting because, I mean, social psychology has always approached collective action traditionally as like crowd action, where everyone has to act for it to be collective. Whereas I've always come from the perspective of like one person can do it as long as they're doing it for the group, right? But what I've seen recently in some unpublished work is that sometimes people will take action on behalf of a group without having group endorsement, and then the group debates whether or not they're okay with it. And it's often when it's extremist, there's kind of extremist motivations, or the action itself, like violence against children, for example, where the group member who perpetrated the action says they did it for the group, and then the group's like, oh no, it's not in our name. And then there's often debate and disagreement on whether or not that was action for the group. So I think this is a really interesting example of well, it kind of questions what collective means in this way. It can be for an individual, but not the collective itself. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I agree with you that there are some really interesting dynamics that are yet unexplored, I think, in social psychology.
Working on it. We'll be in touch about it. Cheers.
Fanny?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Laura, for the presentation. I have a question about the features that you're using. Have you considered using the location of the users, or you're thinking about considering it? Because it's, I think, including the location of the user will do some elimination of the users who think to mobilize if they're from another country or they're moving closer to the location.
Yeah, it would be really useful if we had data on location, but unfortunately most social media, their communications don't include location anymore. People will turn it off. Make life a lot easier to predict mobilization at an event if we could. I know that I think there's a bit of talk at the moment about how location can be ascertained through various different features without actually having location. I think it's like an open question as to how useful or valid that approach will be, but I'm interested in seeing it unfold over the next few years.
Yeah, okay, good. Because I'm actually working on a similar topic where I used actually the location from Twitter, and it's revealing on very good visualizing of the hateful users and targets.
Are you finding that most users did have locations?
Yes, I'm visualizing this on the map. It shows the targets and the haters' locations and how it's actually getting, if they are getting closer to each other, it might increase the threat of having an offline action.
Yeah, super useful when you have the data. Unfortunately, most of our data sets don't have any location information whatsoever.
Thank you.
And it sounds like your work is very useful.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Excellent. And that brings us exactly onto the top of the hour. And I realize other people might have other meetings and so forth. So I guess we'll have to close the meeting at this point, Laura. Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. And so I guess you're okay with this being put up online. We'll put it up on YouTube for those people who couldn't attend. Thank you. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
See you.